Amazing historical photos that you definitely haven't seen yet. Subscribe. New rare selections every day. In February 2000, Russian soldiers paused beside a white table in Grozny as the Second Chechen War neared its end. The scene feels unreal because they are resting in the middle of a city that had been shattered into ruins. On May 8, 1945, in Amsterdam, a Dutch woman accused of ties to the German occupation stood before a crowd with her head shaved and her face covered in tar. The date was the same day Germany surrendered in Europe, and similar public punishments happened in many newly freed cities. After Nanjing fell in 1937, Japanese soldiers posed around a kneeling Chinese prisoner in a scene tied to the Nanjing massacre. Historians still debate the exact number of victims. On the 7th of June 1951, Werner Braune stood in Landsberg prison shortly before his death sentence was carried out after the Einsatzgruppen trial. He had led a mobile Nazi unit during the invasion of the Soviet Union. A 1996 White House photo brought Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump together years before both became central figures in United States politics. It also shows Don Jr. and Eric as children, long before the Trump family became a constant part of national headlines. General Electric engineer Ralph Mosher used the handyman robot to twirl a hula hoop at its debut. The huge machine copied a human operator's arm movements, making it an early version of a remote-controlled robot. From 1962 to 1964, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic spread through schools and affected about 1,000 people, mostly students. It lasted more than 18 months, closed 14 schools, and caused no reported deaths. In 1954, in the Kirov region, a girl at a Soviet state farm showed cabbages grown on a school plot. The oversized head in her hands turned a simple harvest into a striking display of collective farming pride. On April 3, 1976, President Gerald Ford held a football at the dedication of the Green Bay Packers Hall of Fame. The photo linked a sitting United States president with one of the most iconic teams in National Football League history. On April 2, 1935, Robert Watson Watt received a patent for a radio device that could detect and locate aircraft. That idea became radar, a technology that changed air defense and modern navigation. In 1901, Philadelphia, riveters worked on bare steel beams at the William Cramp and Sons shipyard. The photo catches how giant ships were built by hand, high above the dock, with almost no visible safety gear. In 1905, Berlin's Tegel Gas Works looked like a canyon of brick towers and chimneys built to feed the city's gas network. The plant stayed active into the post-war era and closed in 1953. In 1899 in Klondike, Yukon, 3 gold seekers posed in heavy fur at the height of the gold rush. About 100,000 people headed north for this dream, but only a small fraction found real wealth. In 1919, Alaska, this mail truck used 6 wheels and chain tracks to move through deep snow. It shows how early postal service reached remote places where normal road travel could easily fail. Around 1916, French soldiers posed with a dog while all wore gas masks during World War I. Armies made masks for animals too, because dogs, horses, and mules were vital for transport and message work. This early head-mounted 3D display had to hang from the ceiling because the hardware was too heavy to wear on its own. It proves how immersive tech started as a giant machine long before modern headsets existed. In 1929, the Loettaphone linked a gramophone to a film projector so sound could start at the exact right moment. A mercury contact on the film told the needle when to begin, showing how early sound movies were synchronized before modern audio tracks. On September 21, 1927, George R. White stood beside his ornithopter, a machine built to fly by flapping wings like a bird. Its steel frame was covered with celluloid fabric, and the aircraft crashed in testing before later improvements followed. Around 1910 to 1915, this early snow machine used a front ski, rear runners, and an exposed propeller. It shows that motorized winter travel was being tested decades before modern snowmobiles became common. In 1877 to 1878, students at Girton College, Cambridge posed as a women's fire brigade with hoses, ropes, and hand pumps. It captures one of the earliest known college fire teams for women in Britain. In the 1950s, North Korea's leader was photographed speaking with Soviet soldiers during the Korean War. The image shows how closely Pyongyang depended on Soviet support in its earliest years. In 1988, Cambodia's exiled former leader Pol Pot was photographed in Beijing buying a watch for his wife. He had lost power 9 years earlier, which makes this rare everyday scene especially surprising. In 1978 in Houston, most of the Apollo astronauts gathered for a rare group photo beside spacecraft mock-ups. The image packs the moon era into one frame, with men from missions that orbited the moon and landed on it. In 1915, Ernest Shackleton's Endurance sat locked in Antarctic ice during the British Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. The ship never escaped, and its loss led to one of the most famous survival journeys in exploration history. In 1921, Benito Mussolini appeared at a mass rally in Rome as his movement was rapidly gaining power. Within 1 year, he became prime minister, and Italy soon lost its democracy. Between 1916 and 1920, women at the Brooklyn Navy Yard sewed 48-star American flags in long factory rows. That 48-star design stayed official until 1959, so every flag here belongs to the United States before Alaska and Hawaii changed the count. On September 17, 1924, members of the National League of Women Voters held up vote signs just 4 years after women won that right across the United States. It was only the second presidential election in which American women could legally vote. On March 24, 1945, in San Juan, La Union, northern Luzon guerrillas stood with a captured Japanese soldier during the final months of the war in the Philippines. His swollen body showed advanced beriberi from extreme hunger and vitamin B1 deficiency. In 1944, near Antwerp, a Belgian resistance nurse gave first aid to a Canadian soldier during the battle for the city. The photo shows locals and Allied troops working side by side to reopen one of Europe's most important ports. In 1956, in Mongolia, a strong man lifted a massive barbell overhead before a packed crowd. The huge globe weights and outdoor setting made strength a public spectacle, not a gym routine. In 1941 in Manila, women of the Women's Auxiliary Service trained with M1917 rifles under the Philippine Commonwealth Army. The photo shows that women were already being prepared for defense work before the Philippines was pulled fully into the Pacific War. Portuguese women from the Azores wore hooded capes that formed a deep shell around the head and partly hid the face. The style became one of the island's most distinctive traditional outfits and stayed in public use for generations. During Amsterdam's Hunger Winter in 1944, a boy stared into a shop window lined with only a few basic goods. Emmy Andriessen turned this small street scene into one of the clearest images of wartime shortage in the Netherlands. In 1870, Samuel Carnell photographed a Maori man from Hawke's Bay with full facial tamoko, the permanent markings of the Maori people of New Zealand. Traditional tamoko was cut into the skin rather than placed flat like ordinary tattooing. In December 1944 in Athens, British paratroopers of the 2nd Independent Parachute Brigade took cover during the clashes with Elis. The photo shows how Greece moved from liberation to civil conflict almost immediately. Around 1931, a Buick was hoisted outside the Hollywood Plaza Hotel on Vine Street in a stunt linked to actor Edward Everett Horton. Whether it was a real delivery or a publicity trick, the photo turned a new car into a spectacle hanging high above the street. In 1943, Britain tested the Panjandrum, a giant rocket-powered wheel meant to break coastal defenses before an invasion. The trials quickly spun out of control, turning it into one of the strangest military ideas of World War II. Before Okinawa, United States Underwater Demolition Team men covered their bodies with aluminum paint as camouflage. The silver coating was meant to confuse Japanese snipers before a high-risk beach mission. A crowd gathered around a bomber in a United States factory as aircraft production surged during World War II. By 1944, American industry was turning out nearly 100,000 military aircraft a year. In 1921 in Cornwall, 4 surfers posed with homemade wooden boards on the beach. The photo shows how early British surfing looked before modern boards, wetsuits, and surf culture existed. In the 1970s, New York City, children stood in a rubble-filled vacant lot between brick tenements. In parts of the Bronx, fires, abandonment, and disinvestment turned whole blocks into scenes like this. In 1933 in Munich, waiters at Bayer's Eat Cafe wore oversized carnival masks while serving guests. The bird and animal faces made an ordinary cafe scene look strangely modern and unforgettable. In 1938 in Alberta, 2 boys crossed a swamp using a metal tub and a wooden box as makeshift boats. Each held a paddle, turning scrap containers into a working ride through the marsh. In 1989 in Dhanbad, Bihar, coal miners faced the camera coated in black dust, with only their eyes and lips standing out. Dhanbad was India's coal capital, and this portrait shows how the job marked workers before they even left the mine. In 1919, workers used cranes and braces to repair Stonehenge after some stones had become unstable. The image looks like a construction site, but it shows restoration of an ancient monument, not its creation. In 1943 in Maryland, a family ate inside a compact mobile home in the Glen L. Martin housing project. The narrow room held a table, crib, stove, and bed, showing how an entire household fit into one streamlined space. Before vents were added, a locomotive tender cracked open during tests of a new water scoop. Pressure built up inside the tank so fast that water burst out across the tracks. Starting in 1904 with $1.50, 5 girls, and her son, Mary McLeod Bethune, built a school that grew into one of the most important black institutions in the United States. About 23 years later, she was advising the President of the United States. A colonial-era photo from the Congo shows a missionary being carried by Congolese locals instead of walking himself. It became a stark symbol of Belgian rule when extraction and forced labor shaped daily life across the Congo Free State. Around 1970 in Staten Island, a McDonald's crew posed behind the counter with an early Ronald McDonald. The menu board still shows burgers, fries, and fish sandwiches, all priced under $1. In 1955, James Dean posed inside a coffin in a publicity photo that later became famous for its eerie irony. The image locked a rising Hollywood star into one of the strangest and most unforgettable poses of the decade. In the 1950s, test mannequins like these were placed in houses and cars during United States nuclear trials. Their frozen smiles made them look unreal, but they were built to show how heat and shock would affect everyday life. Around 1937 to 1938 in Nanjing, Japanese soldiers posed with 2 Chinese girls in a staged propaganda photo. Images like this were used to make occupation look calm and controlled, even when life around them was far harsher. In 1974, the tunnels beneath Danvers State Hospital ran under the sprawling psychiatric complex like a hidden second level. They carried pipes, wires, and staff routes, making the hospital feel even larger below ground than above it. In the mid-20th century, crews sprayed DDT in huge clouds to kill mosquitoes and farm pests. It worked fast, but the chemical stayed in nature for years and was later banned in many countries. During Prohibition in the United States, officials dumped seized alcohol while barrels and bottles piled up around them. From 1920 to 1933, the ban did not stop drinking and instead pushed the trade underground. In 1940, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge tore apart in the wind only months after it opened. The collapse became one of the most famous engineering failures in history. In the 1930s and 1940s, lobotomy was promoted in hospitals as a modern treatment for severe mental illness. It later became infamous because many patients were left with lasting cognitive and emotional problems. Robert Falcon Scott stands beside a loaded sledge during his Antarctic expedition. After reaching the South Pole in 1912, his party never made it back and was found only 11 miles from a supply depot. In 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto lay in ruins after Jewish resistance fighters rose against German control. Badly outmatched, they held out for weeks and turned the ghetto into one of the strongest symbols of resistance in occupied Europe. In 1956, Chen Shung Wu ran the experiment that showed nature does not always behave the same in a mirror. The result overturned a basic law of physics and became one of the biggest breakthroughs of the 1900s. Amelia Earhart sits in a Department of Commerce aircraft at the height of early American aviation. In 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. On March 10, 1944, near Uman, Soviet soldiers inspected a German Panther tank abandoned in the deep spring mud of Rasputitsa. The photo shows how Eastern Front mud could stop even one of Germany's strongest tanks. On June 4, 1942, USS Yorktown is seen under attack at Midway after a torpedo strike from aircraft launched by the Japanese carrier Hiryu. The carrier had already survived earlier damage that day, but this blow helped seal the fate of one of the most important American ships in the Pacific. In May 1945, crewmen hoisted a torpedo from a submarine tender into a submarine about to leave on patrol. One weapon like this could decide an entire mission, which makes the loading scene feel tense even before the boat sailed. On July 29, 1945, USS Pritchett showed heavy hull damage after a kamikaze exploded close by while the ship was rescuing survivors from USS Callahan. The photo proves how even a near miss could tear open steel during the final weeks of the Pacific War. In July 1957 in Worcester, Massachusetts, an Air National Guard jet came down in a residential street and left smoke and wreckage outside the homes. Both crew members were lost, but no civilians were reported injured, even though several houses were badly damaged. In 1994, 26-year-old Anna Nicole Smith posed with 89-year-old J. Howard Marshall soon after their marriage. After his death the next year, a long court fight over his fortune made this photo far more famous. In August 1997, Princess Diana walked with Prince William in one of their last photos together. It was taken only weeks before her death, which made this simple street moment historic. In 1966 in Chicago, 24-year-old Muhammad Ali was photographed at a bakery with 16-year-old Belinda Boyd, who later became his wife. They married in 1967, turning this casual shop moment into an early glimpse of a famous relationship. This 2004 portrait shows a Dutch filmmaker whose work sparked one of the Netherlands' biggest free speech debates that year. His film Submission drew fierce controversy, and the image became far more haunting after his death later in 2004. Amanda America Dixon was born in Georgia to an enslaved 13-year-old girl and her owner, David Dixon. When he died in 1885, he left her nearly his entire estate, making her one of the richest black women in the post-Civil War South. On July 28, 1994, Dr. John Britton was photographed in Pensacola holding the revolver he carried for protection while working at a women's health clinic. The next day, he and his guard, James Barrett, lost their lives outside the clinic, which turned this into a chilling final portrait. In May 1922, Audrey Munson, often called America's first supermodel, was 30 and already one of the most recognizable faces in American art and early film. Her fame collapsed soon after, but she lived until 1996 and reached the age of 104. In the 1970s, a Rhodesian soldier paused for a smoke break during the Bush War with a rifle across his knees. His sneakers, camouflage, and worn field gear show how rough and improvised frontline life could look in that conflict. In 1936, swastika flags covered a street in Germany, showing how deeply the Nazi regime had taken over public life before World War II. The most unsettling detail is how ordinary the street looks, with daily life moving under symbols of dictatorship. In 1910, Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach was still years away from the inkblot test that made his name famous. He published it in 1921, and his surname became one of the most recognizable words in psychology, on Iwo Jima. In 1945, 2 United States soldiers worked at a tunnel entrance after Japanese troops remained hidden underground. Even after the surface battle was nearly over, the island's cave system kept the fighting going below ground. In 1985 in Oaxaca, a young woman looked straight at the camera during a public celebration. Her dress, jewelry, and woven hat captured a vivid moment of Oaxacan folk culture. In England around 1980, punk, rude boy, and skinhead style appear side by side here, from the Union Jack shirt to the pork pie hat and close-shaved head. One small street photo puts 3 youth scenes that shaped late 1970s and early 1980s, Britain shoulder to shoulder. A 1956 wedding photo catches a film icon smiling as she cuts the cake beside her new husband, a major American writer. The marriage joined 2 of the most watched names of the era and lasted only until 1961. In 1941, a homeless man walks through the Warsaw Ghetto, where more than 400,000 Jews were confined behind walls in German-occupied Poland. The district covered only about 3.4 square kilometers, making it one of the most crowded urban spaces in Europe. In 1991, an Ethiopian Jewish man carries his mother into Israel during Operation Solomon, the airlift that moved more than 14,000 people in about 36 hours. One plane from that mission carried over 1,000 passengers, setting a world record at the time. In California, around 1961, young surfers raced down the road with boards piled high, showing the rough beach crew style that ruled many local breaks. At that time, surfing was still a small youth scene, decades before it became a global industry and an Olympic sport. Widely known as Freddie Mercury's last photo, this 1991 image shows him at Garden Lodge in London with one of his cats by his side. Very few pictures of him were taken in 1991, so this quiet garden shot became one of the most famous images from his final months. Maradona lifts his trouser leg to show Fidel Castro the portrait tattoo of Castro on his left calf during a meeting in Cuba. He also wore a Che Guevara tattoo, turning his body into one of football's most unexpected political statements. On April 9, 1968, Jackie Kennedy speaks with Coretta Scott King at Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral after losing her own husband in 1963. The image brings together 2 women marked by national tragedy only 4 years and 5 months apart. Rosa Abdul-Khalik appears here in the 1990s at age 26, identified as Yemen's first female pilot. Her captain's stripes turn this quiet portrait into a rare record of a national first in aviation. In 1960, Dwight Eisenhower eats a hot dog while Richard Nixon smokes at a baseball game, a rare casual image of the White House pair in public. The photo was taken only months before Nixon lost the 1960 presidential election. An identified portrait of a man with Down syndrome from the 1890s is unusual, especially from a time when studio photos were formal and costly. The condition had been medically described only in 1866. In the 1930s, many poor families made children's clothes from empty flour sacks because new fabric was too expensive. Feed companies noticed this and began printing the sacks with bright patterns. On May 16, 1994, Vladimir Putin guides Prince Charles through St. Petersburg while still a city official, not yet a national figure. The image catches a future Russian ruler in an ordinary public role, years before the world learned his name. In Jerusalem in 1967, a Palestinian teenager offers a small souvenir to 2 female Israeli soldiers during a brief street encounter. Israel used female conscription, so women in uniform were a common public sight. At Pomona College in California in 1954, first-year women could be publicly measured by football players during the weigh-in. The practice recorded body proportions of incoming female students as part of a campus event. In 1988, a young Nation of Islam protester stands outside Trump Tower holding a sign that says, "Trump is a chump." The photo was taken by Ricky Flores in Manhattan, years before Donald Trump entered presidential politics. In 1915, a Mexican soldier holds his daughter at a train station before leaving during the Mexican Revolution. The revolution lasted from 1910 to 1920 and reshaped Mexico's army, government, and land system. In 1930, in Curitiba, Paraná, Tetsunosuke Yamamoto and Maria de Cruz dos Santos posed for a rare wedding photo of a Japanese man and a black Brazilian woman. Their marriage is considered one of the first official records of a Japanese and black union in the state of Paraná. A studio portrait from about 1863 shows a black man with dwarfism in formal dress, holding a hat beside a carved chair. The photo dates to the American Civil War era, when studio portraits were costly and far less common than later mass photography. In 1944, African tirailleurs removed their uniforms after dismissal from the French army during the policy known as blanchiment, or whitening. By 1944, the French Army of Liberation had about 400,000 soldiers, and about 60% came from colonial territories. In 1967, 19-year-old Private First Class Helmut Schmuck of the 173rd Airborne Brigade waits inside a transport aircraft before his first jump in Vietnam. The 173rd was the first major United States Army ground unit sent to South Vietnam in 1965. This image is identified as the last photo of Laurie Turney, taken on October 15, 1965, in South Vietnam, 3 days before the helicopter crash in which he died. He served in the Finnish Army, later with German forces during World War II. On February 21, 1978, electric workers in central Mexico City accidentally uncovered the Coyolxauhqui stone, a giant Mexica monolith buried beneath the streets. The disc is about 3.25 meters wide. In 1914, 25-year-old Adolf Hitler enlisted in the German army at the start of World War I. By 1918, he had reached the rank of corporal and received the Iron Cross First Class and Second Class. A 1989 family photo from Johannesburg shows a white mother and child seated while a black domestic worker remains on the floor beside them. In 1989, South Africa was still under apartheid, the system of legal racial segregation that began in 1948. This image is identified as a 1935 to 1937 photograph of an Italian air attack in Ethiopia during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. The Italian government denied using chemical weapons in that war until the late 1980s. In Rome, rows of troops and Fiat 3000 tanks move along Via dei Fori Imperiali during a formal parade. The Fiat 3000 entered Italian service in 1921 and was based on the French Renault FT. In December 1942, in Fezzan, an Italian officer directs Libyan Askari troops from a desert trench in Libya. Askari were colonial soldiers recruited by Italy, and Tripoli fell just 1 month later in January 1943. A Caro Commando M41 command vehicle from the Nettunia Artillery School appears here in an Italian military training photo. This type was tied to Semovente da Nineti/53 units, and 3 examples remained in continental Italy as training vehicles. On April 1, 1984, Marvin Gaye Sr. is photographed in custody after the family dispute in Los Angeles, in which singer Marvin Gaye died. Marvin Gaye had turned 45 on March 31, 1984, just 1 day earlier. In November 1956, British heavyweight boxer Henry Cooper serves a customer at the greengrocer he ran on Wembley High Road in London. He later won the British, Commonwealth, and European heavyweight titles. While you're looking at these photos, write in the comments which historical frame you like the most and why. In April 1945, paratrooper Harry Lorenzo of the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion sits near Katharienburg, Germany, holding a Thompson submachine gun and his puppy, Kaput. The photo was taken less than 1 month before Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. In 1982, 14-year-old Celine Dion sits with her family beside her manager, René Angelil, who was 39. He first backed her career after hearing her demo when she was 12, and they married in 1994. In 1913, the New York City Department of Health gathered girls in the Little Mothers League, where those aged 12 to 16 were taught how to care for babies while their mothers worked. By 1915, about 25,000 girls had enrolled. In 1945, the Demon Corps was the plutonium corps prepared for a third wartime atomic bomb that was never used. It later caused 2 fatal laboratory accidents during criticality tests in 1945 and 1946. On September 22, 1939, German and Soviet troops stood together in Brest-Litovsk after both powers invaded Poland from opposite directions. The parade followed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, which secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of control. In the 13th century, Cistercian monks used a number system that could write any value from 1 to 9,999 with one symbol. The sign changed by adding small strokes in 4 positions, each position marking units, tens, hundreds, or thousands. In the 1920s, Harlem at the 125th Street Ferry, a street vendor dressed as a cowboy sold toy rubber snakes with a coin changer strapped to his belt. In the 1920s, Harlem was the center of the Harlem Renaissance, a major black cultural movement in New York. On April 2, 1902, Tally's Electric Theater opened in Los Angeles and is widely cited as the first full-time movie theater in the United States. It was founded by Thomas Lincoln Talley and screened short motion pictures for paying audiences on a permanent basis. In September 1937, in Craigville, Minnesota, a man lests at a bar while a small dog presses against his face in a quiet Saturday night scene, photographed by Russell Lee. Lee made the image for the Farm Security Administration. In March 1945, Lieutenant Commander Gerald R. Pearson displays captured Japanese swords after the Battle of Iwo Jima. United States forces landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, and fighting on the island continued until March 26, 1945. In 1921, newly arrived Jewish immigrants in Boston held a Passover Seder at the East Boston Immigration Station with support from the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. The society had been aiding Jewish immigrants since 1881. In 1988, Tommy Thompson found the SS Central America, a ship lost in 1857 with more than $50 million in gold. In 2015, he was jailed after saying he could not remember where 500 recovered gold coins were hidden. On November 3, 1979, members of the Ku Klux Klan and the National Socialist Party attacked an anti-Klan march in Greensboro, North Carolina, and 5 demonstrators died. The defendants were later acquitted by an all-white jury. Belarusians marched through Minsk on April 2, 1996, protesting deeper ties with Russia. That same day, Alexander Lukashenko and Boris Yeltsin signed the treaty creating the Community of Belarus and Russia. An 1842 photo shows the Pantheon, one of the best preserved buildings of ancient Rome. It was completed around 125 and stayed intact, largely because it became a church in 609. In 1843, Richard Beard's daguerreotype studio captured a sitter facing the camera while the operator prepared the exposure. Beard opened Britain's first commercial portrait studio in 1841, and daguerreotype portraits required people to stay still for long seconds. In 1843, Lane and Petty posed in Afghan costume in one of photography's earliest decades. In the 1840s, portraits still needed long exposure times, so sitters had to stay very still. Miss Monroe and Mrs. Binney pose for a studio portrait in 1845 during the first decade of practical photography. In 1845, portrait exposures were still long enough that even slight movement could blur the image. The Great Baltimore Fire of 1904 destroyed more than 1,500 buildings across about 70 city blocks in the city center. It burned for over 30 hours, and many outside fire crews could not connect their hoses to Baltimore hydrants. In 1960 in North Carolina, NAACP protesters carried signs urging people not to spend money at stores that would not hire black workers. The slogan turned shopping into economic pressure during the Civil Rights Movement. In 1881 in Kankakee, a man stands beside a huge clay vessel used to store wine in Georgia. Some of these vessels held thousands of liters and were buried in the ground to keep the wine cool. Around 1915, British soldiers in the trenches made improvised grenades from empty tin cans because standard hand grenades were still scarce. Early in World War I, frontline units often relied on homemade weapons like these before factory production caught up. Around 1940 on England's south coast, children jump rope wearing gas masks as wartime air raid precautions became part of daily life. By 1939, Britain had issued about 38 million gas masks to civilians, including children. In the early 1920s, Spanish heavyweight boxer Paulino Euskudun, known as the Basque Woodcutter, was photographed with his famous broken smile. He later fought Max Baer in 1933 and Joe Louis in 1935. In 1912, a blind man tests a device designed to turn light into sound. The instrument converted changes in light into tones, so bright and dark areas could be detected by ear. Around 1900, Welsh strongwoman Vulcana, born Miriam Kate Williams, was photographed at the height of her stage career. She performed in music halls with her partner Atlas and became one of Britain's best-known female strength acts. In 1922, performer Mary Nellie stood beside Clarence Chesterfield Howerton, then billed as the world's smallest man. Nellie was said to weigh 292 kilograms, and Howerton was reported at 71 centimeters tall. Albino performer Unzi Cherkes was known for his huge hair as much as for his stage image. In this portrait, the hair spreads wider than his shoulders and rises high above his head. Lucia Zarate was a Mexican circus performer billed for her extraordinarily small size. At age 17, she was reported to weigh about 2.1 kilograms. Maria Oktyabrskaya joined the Red Army after her husband died in 1941 and later served as a T-34 driver and mechanic. She paid for the tank herself, named it Fighting Girlfriend, and died in 1944. In August 1939 in North China, Red Army troops gathered for a spiritual mobilization rally before counteroffensives in the Sino-Japanese War. The war had begun in 1937, and mass political meetings were used to prepare soldiers for coming campaigns. In 1916 in Odessa, volunteers for the Serbian army relax after exercises. Many were South Slavs taken as Austro-Hungarian prisoners in Russia and later recruited into Serbian units. In 1980, Japan's Liberal Democratic Party celebrated election victory with a memorial portrait of Prime Minister Masayoshi Ohira, who died during the campaign. Ohira died on June 12, 1980, and the party went on to win the June 22nd election. In 1919, British troops stand in formation in occupied Constantinople, now Istanbul. Allied forces took control of the city after the Ottoman defeat in 1918 and remained until 1923. In 1935, Prague's Old Town Square filled with umbrellas and flags around the Christmas tree of the Republic. The tree stood before the Church of Our Lady before Teen during a public holiday gathering. In 1919, Queen Marie of Romania personally lobbied Allied leaders in Paris for recognition of Greater Romania after World War I. After the peace settlement, Romania reached about 295,000 square kilometers, nearly double its pre-war size. After the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, Greenwood and Tulsa lay in ruins, including the district known as Black Wall Street. Over about 18 hours, white mobs destroyed roughly 35 city blocks, and an estimated 100 to 300 black residents were killed. In May 1921, Dublin's Custom House was set on fire during a major Irish Republican Army operation in the Irish War of Independence. The building was nearly destroyed, and the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed later that year. Sylvia Pankhurst attends a breakfast held after one of her releases during the fight for women's voting rights in Britain. She was arrested 15 times in that campaign and later supported anti-fascist and anti-colonial causes. On April 2, 1945, in Münster, a German prisoner runs past a Churchill tank of the 4th Coldstream Guards and paratroopers of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The scene came just 36 days before the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. German soldiers eat chicken in June 1941 during the first days of Operation Barbarossa, a moment from the short phase when the campaign still looked easy. About 17 months later at Stalingrad, the German 6th Army was cut off from supply. In 1923 Germany, banknotes became so cheap that some families burned them for heat instead of buying firewood. By November 1923, one United States dollar was worth about 4.2 trillion German marks. An injured German prisoner is questioned near Gilza in the Netherlands on October 27, 1944, after the Polish 1st Armored Division broke through the Breda-Tilburg front. That day, the division captured Alphen and Gilza and then pushed toward Breda. At the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, signs like this mocked the Soviet boycott and showed how openly Cold War politics surrounded the Games. Even with many Soviet allies absent, 6,829 athletes from 140 countries still competed in Los Angeles. Ethel Rose James, granddaughter of Jesse James, stands outside a California cafe built in 1928 as a copy of the family cabin near Kansas City. She poses with her grandfather's rifles and the boots he was wearing when he died in 1882. In April 1945, Berlin workers used wrecked trams as barricades near Ernst-Reuter-Platz to slow advancing tanks in the final days of the city's defense. Berlin surrendered on May 2, 1945, and Germany signed its final surrender on May 8, 1945. Mail carriers pose with bicycles outside the post office in Avoca, Texas, around 1915, from the moment when two-wheel delivery was speeding up mail in rural America. Rural free delivery began in 1896, and by 1920, the United States Post Office was serving millions of farm families directly. After Bataan fell in 1942, Captain Russell W. Volkmann escaped and built one of the largest resistance forces in the Philippines. That force later helped corner General Tomoyuki Yamashita in northern Luzon, and he surrendered at Kiangan, Ifugao, on September 2, 1945. Father Francis J. Ronan celebrates Mass inside a Navy tunnel on Corregidor on April 5, 1942, showing how worship continued underground during the island's final month of defense. Corregidor fell on May 6, 1942, only 31 days later. Old studio photos like these helped build the image of pit bull-type dogs as calm family pets in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The label nanny dog was not a standard 1800s breed name and became popular much later. Jack Johnson became the first black world heavyweight champion in 1908 and later patented a wrench, a rare detail that connects boxing and invention history. His United States patent number 1413121 was granted on April 18, 1922. A tiny figure at the lower left became the first known person clearly captured in a photograph because he stood still long enough during the long exposure. Louis Daguerre made this Paris street image in 1838 from a window above Boulevard du Temple. These white gas masks turned ordinary soldiers into one of the most unreal sights of World War I in 1917. The first large-scale gas attack on the Western Front happened in 1915, and by 1917, masks had become standard gear across the trenches. A Hiroshima shadow like this formed when the atomic flash bleached the surface around a person or object in an instant, leaving one dark shape behind. The bomb exploded over Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945. A normal Christmas photo from 1981 later became infamous because the father was Dennis Rader, the man known as BTK. He was arrested in 2005, more than 30 years after his first known crimes. These were not rocks at all, but women from the United States Reserve Camouflage Corps hiding in plain sight in Van Cortlandt Park, Bronx, in 1918. The Corps trained artists and designers to build decoys, fake cover, and visual traps for military use during World War I. Polish fighters drove a captured German half-track through Warsaw during the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, turning an enemy vehicle into a rare symbol of resistance. The uprising lasted 63 days from August 1st to October 2nd, 1944. Long lines on the sand at Dunkirk capture the moment when Britain turned a retreat into one of the most famous escapes of World War II. Between 26 May and 4 June 1940, Operation Dynamo evacuated more than 338,000 British and Allied troops from the beaches and harbor. Belle Starr became one of the most famous women of the American frontier, with newspapers calling her the Bandit Queen. She was born in 1848 and died in 1889 at age 40. Nicole van den Hurk was 15 when she vanished on her bicycle on the way to work in the Netherlands in 1995, and the case stayed cold for 2 decades. A false confession from her stepbrother forced the case open again, and later, genetic testing linked it to Josta G. A camp doctor at Auschwitz became infamous for deciding within seconds who would be sent to forced labor and who would not. He escaped Europe after 1945, lived in South America for decades, and died in Brazil in 1979. This red robe and axe belonged to Giovanni Bugatti, the man assigned to carry out papal justice in Rome for nearly 70 years. From 1796 to 1864, he performed 514 official death sentences. John Smith, a formerly enslaved man, sits outside his home in North Carolina in 1937, turning one quiet portrait into a direct link to the era of American slavery. Slavery was abolished in the United States 72 years earlier, in 1865. One family photo hides one of the darkest decisions in American political history. Rosemary Kennedy was subjected to a lobotomy at age 23. The procedure was done in 1941 and left her needing full-time care until her death in 2005. A widely shared caption links this photo to Mahmoud Darwish and Tamar Ben-Ami, tying one quiet moment to the love story behind some of his most famous poems. Darwish was born in 1941, helped draft the Palestinian Declaration of Independence in 1988, and died in 2008. A normal youth baseball photo later became tied to a child abduction case from 1995. Thad Phillips was 13 when he was taken from his home, escaped after nearly 2 days, and later learned to walk again. Jenny Wanda Barkman stands beside piles of shoes at Stutthof, where prisoners' belongings were collected and sorted. Stutthof operated from 1939 to 1945, and more than 60,000 people died there. 4 women pose at Chicken Bone Beach in Atlantic City in the early 1960s, one of the few beach areas where black visitors gathered during segregation. The name came from picnic leftovers left in the sand. A Palestinian woman holds her child in a 1920s portrait, with her dress, jewelry, and head covering preserving details of everyday life from a century ago. The image comes from the period of British rule in Palestine, which lasted from 1920 to 1948. Port Authority officer Chris Amoroso is seen on September 11, 2001, after helping a pregnant woman away from the World Trade Center site. He then went back in for a fifth rescue attempt and was 29 years old when he did not return. This 1991 prison mugshot pairs Jeffrey Dahmer with Christopher Scarver, the inmate tied to Dahmer's final day in a Wisconsin prison in 1994. Scarver later claimed Dahmer's behavior inside prison, including shaping food into limb-like forms, deeply unsettled other inmates. German soldiers pose as they knock the head from a Stalin statue in 1941, turning a political symbol into a battlefield trophy. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, and by December, German forces were already at the edge of Moscow. Andrei Chikatilo smiles inside a courtroom cage during his 1992 trial, creating one of the most unsettling courtroom images of the late Soviet era. He was sentenced on October 15, 1992. Jane Russell sketches Marilyn Monroe during the filming of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1953, catching a rare moment when one Hollywood star quietly drew another. The film was released in 1953 and became one of the most famous Monroe and Russell pairings on screen. In 1982, Susie Phipps challenged Louisiana after finding out her birth certificate listed her as colored because the state measured ancestry by fractions. She lost, and the state would not change the document. This photo captures the French crackdown that followed Algerian demonstrations on May 8, 1945, one of the darkest turning points of colonial Algeria. The repression after the protests in Sétif, Guelma, and Karata left thousands dead. A Bosnian family breaks down at Tuzla after the father survives a 6-day escape from Srebrenica, turning one reunion into the face of the war. In July 1995, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed after the fall of Srebrenica. If you like such rare historical photos, subscribe to the channel. There are new interesting stories here every day.